Welcome back, everyone, to Pet Square's Geek's Guide to the Beach Boys, and here we are. We are going to be talking about the most famous album the Beach Boys ever recorded. In fact, one of the greatest albums of all time, as is widely acknowledged. Pet Sounds, the 1966 revolutionary long player, masterminded by the Beach Boys leader Brian Wilson. We're going to be delving quite deeply into it, as we do here on this show. Now, before we get into it, I want to confess that I've been dreading doing this album, and not because I don't love it. Of course, who doesn't love Pet Sounds? But one of the points of doing this show for me has been to try to bring a new perspective to the band's history, and going through these albums with the perspective, on one hand, of having been a fan of the band since I was in my early teens, and on the other hand, of being a working musician, and, as I've said before, probably the person that is most intimately familiar with the music in terms of having played it live, that hasn't directly drawn a paycheck from the Beach Boys, which enables me to talk a little bit more freely about this stuff. So, hopefully, as this series has gone on, I've given everybody a little bit of information or perspective on the band you haven't been able to get elsewhere. And the Beach Boys podcast and YouTube world has exploded. There's lots and lots of Beach Boys analytical shows. There were when I started this show, and there are even more now. So the difficulty in approaching Pet Sounds for me is it's one thing to bring new perspective to an album like Shutdown Volume 2, which hasn't had a lot of attention drawn to it. But Pet Sounds is easily one of the most overanalyzed rock albums ever. When I was doing some research for this show and going on Wikipedia, there is extensive information on every track, right down to, I kid you not, what kind of train was it? What was the model? When was it built that was forming the sound effect for the end of Caroline No? So for me to further elaborate on the level of detail that's already been visited upon this album, it would require a very tiresome 100-episode series. So I was thinking about how I wanted to approach this. And one idea was just to sort of skip it, just do one episode and be on with it. And I realized pretty quickly that no one was going to put up with that. So I've decided I'm going to grasp the nettle and get fairly deep into the recording. And I'll be doing multi-parts about this album. And as a result, unlike prior episodes, I'm not even going to attempt to get through the whole album in one filming or one video sitting. I'm just going to do little bite-sized pieces as we go along. So today we're going to be basically covering the overview of the album. And I did mention before and at the outset of the series that I am a professional musician, and I've probably played Beach Boys music at, more often, and played more different songs in more different situations than just about anybody in the world who hasn't directly worked with the Beach Boys. I mean, I have worked with some of the Beach Boys occasionally, but I'm not like a Scott Totten or a Darian Sahanaja, both guys that have way more depth than I do, but they've worked with the Beach Boys for years and years and years. So in analyzing this album, I have been involved twice in separate decades, in 1996 and in 2014, with two separate stagings of this album, performing the entire album and being involved with those. And it's probably the album that has the most songs that I, as a musician, have performed and or recorded over the course of my career. So I'll probably, to give you some unique perspective on the album, I'll be talking a little bit more about my personal experiences playing this music than I otherwise would. I don't like to make, I like to bring in my own experiences to the show to make it more entertaining, and as I said, give it a dimension you might not necessarily be able to get from this or that other show. But, this isn't about me, this is about the Beach Boys, so it's all in service of greater understanding or perspective on the band's career, both from looking at it as a fan and looking at it as a musician. Because I think in terms of understanding what happened to the band in its history, the different dynamics in play, and especially for Pet Sounds, because this is where the band reaches its artistic peak and things start to fall apart for them. I think having that duality of experience as a fan and a musician working inside the industry will give, I hope, an extra dimension to understanding how Brian was able to scale these artistic peaks, what was special about them, and also why it didn't necessarily lead to a good outcome in the short term for the band. So all that is to say, I'm going to do my very best to give you something special and unique in talking about this pivotal and historic album by the Beach Boys. So without any further ado, let's get into the overview of Pet Sounds. So Pet Sounds is released on May 16th, 1966. It famously goes to number 10 in the US for 1 week. Conventional wisdom holds that to be significantly under the commercial peaks of the Beach Boys' preceding records. This is true. There is additional perspective to be discussed there, however, and we're going to get quite far into that. It's not as widely appreciated in the US, but the album did extremely well in Britain. The Beach Boys up to that time had some success in the UK. They'd had one top 10 hit, I Get Around, and a couple of sort of middling hits after that. But this was their first smash, and it went to number 2 in the UK. So definitely different reactions to the album, and we're going to also discuss why that was and how that set the band on a different path in their homeland than it did in Europe. But before we even get to that, we need to go back to the summer of 1965 and discuss the events that led up to this album. And one of the things that I have noticed in researching this record is the curious situation of Brian's output in the second half of 1965. And for this, we're going to go to Andrew Doe's most estimable website, Bellagio10452.com, and look at the timeline, which is something I always like to do. And I would like to acknowledge Andrew's help with some aspects of this episode, and especially, as always, from Beach Boys archivist Craig Slowinski, who gave me some insight as to what was going on in the political situation with Capitol Records. It's something else we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So one thing in all of the analysis of this album I've not really seen discussed is what the heck Brian was doing in the second half of 1965. Because if you'll recall, Brian had left the touring band at the outset of 1965, and he had cut the Beach Boys Today album. And the Beach Boys Today album was the first album that was largely cut with the guys from the Wrecking Crew, the elite LA session musicians that Brian, up to that point, had used frequently but sparingly. As I've often said, it's a misconception that the Beach Boys did not play on their own records. They actually largely did up until 1965. And the Wrecking Crew they had individuals brought in to augment them or sort of keep them on track. In other words, Dennis usually played drums on the tracks, but Hal Blaine was around to kind of keep time on percussion or sometimes a second set of drums. Al Jardine likewise usually played bass, but there was usually another bass guy, session guy, doubling him. So that was kind of how it went along. So then Brian comes to the band at the beginning of 65 and says, look, I can't keep going on the road with you guys and make 3 albums a year. I need to be able to stay home and develop these sounds, and we're going to get a replacement. I'm going to keep producing records for you. Everything's going to be great. So the band freaks out a little bit, but then they settle into this working arrangement where Brian stays home most of the time, does a couple of shows with the band in 65, but for the most part, he's back in LA. He's theoretically developing their new music, and the band is taking his vision out on the road and driving record sales that way. So this is the agreement in 1965. So we get the Beach Boys Today. Brian cuts that in January over the course of about 2 weeks, and actually couple sessions in December. So it's a little more than 2 weeks, but the bulk of the recording happens in 2 weeks in January. And then the band goes on the road. Brian's on the road a little bit with them, not much. And then we get into March. They do Help Me Rhonda, and I think a little bit of California Girls in there. They start getting into the Summer Days and Summer Nights album, which is the first actual fruit of this new arrangement, right? The band's going to tour, Brian's going to record. So Brian records the Summer Days and Summer Nights album and also the Guess I'm Dumb single for Glenn Campbell. That all happens in the spring. And that the pace is now getting a little more relaxed for Brian, because you can see here this little orange block. This is all the Today sessions, right? And then all this orange in here is the Summer Days sessions, and you've got, some happening in March, and you've got some, going in April and May. But, fairly comparatively relaxed pace, but still pretty productive. And Brian finally wraps up the album in early June. And then the Summer Days and Summer Nights album comes out pretty soon after that, July 5th. So far so good, right? And the Summer Days and Summer Nights album is pretty good, and the Beach Boys Today album is pretty good, so everyone's kind of happy. Okay. So then the next thing that occurs is that Al Jardine comes in and says to Brian, hey, I want us to do Sloop John B., which was an old song by the Kingston Trio, which was Al Jardine's favorite band. The folk boom is in full bloom at that point in mid-65. Al thinks they should get in on it. He knows Brian is not a folk fan, as we see on his satirical take on the folk music movement on the Beach Boys Party album, which is soon to follow. So Al rejiggers the arrangement to Sloop John B. to please Brian's ear. And Brian seems very disinterested in this, but according to Al's account, in 24 hours, turns around the rather amazing instrumental track that forms the basis of the final released hit single that doesn't come out for another 9 months, okay? So they do Summer Days and Summer Nights. Then Al comes in and says, hey, I got this song. Brian doesn't seem to care, but then immediately drops everything and records it, which is very interesting. But the band doesn't do any vocals for it until December. It just sits there. And they don't actually release the song until, I think, was March of 66. So it's interesting to me that Brian isn't all that interested, seemingly, in what Al brings to him with this idea of doing a Kingston Trio song and redoing it in a sort of a more proto-psychedelic Beach Boys style. And yet he just drops everything and does it. Now, this has been put down to Brian's eccentricity and his sort of spontaneous nature, and that is true. And I'm also not sure that Al's account that he had turned it around in 24 hours is completely accurate, but it does seem to be true that Al plays in the recording. Brian seems disinterested, but then goes off and does this full-blown arrangement that everybody is very impressed and taken with. And the record of the timeline is quite clear that it takes them 5 or 6 months to actually get around to doing the vocals. So the first thing I say is that if Brian is home working on all these new tunes just post Summer Days and Summer Nights, because this occurs in I guess in July 12th. Yes, July 12th, Sloop John B., the first session happens. So if Brian has a ton of new songs that he's working on in the wake of Summer Days and Summer Nights, which has now been done for 5 weeks, is he really going to drop everything and work on Sloop John B? Well, maybe. But the interesting thing is, what else is he working on? And so, as I told you, all these orange bands here, this is on Andrew's website, this is when the band's recording. So let's go into July. Let's look for some orange bands here. Well, you see there's only one for Sloop John B, and then there's another one for a session that apparently didn't happen. And then we get into August, and you see this orange band here. This is for the Beach Boys Party album. Now remember, Brian's whole justification for making Beach Boys Party is he's not going to have an album ready for Christmas. Capitol wants a Beach Boys album for Christmas. Brian knows they're not going to get it. So he does Beach Boys Party. Well, okay, but it's he's had 2 months to work up new material, and it's late August now, and Brian's throwing in the towel like, well, I'm not going to be ready for Christmas. Let's work on the Party album. So then, if you look at what Brian actually is doing, the next thing he's doing is Party. And that takes up August and some of September, and they finish it up in late September. And then he gets to the new single, which is Little Girl I Once Knew, which is Brian's first fully fledged new studio recording, sort of following on the thread that carries from Today through Summer Days and Summer Nights to Pet Sounds. So all this time, what's Brian doing? Because he, from June all the way into late August, the only thing he does apparently is Sloop John B. Now we're going to get into, this may not be 100% true, but he's not going on the road. He's not producing anything for anybody else. And the whole premise behind this arrangement is Brian's going to stay home and work up stuff for him. So if you look at the discussions of the Pet Sounds album, and when people talk about this period, people will say Brian was formulating ideas for his new album. So I'm not, I don't want to be misunderstood here. Brian gets to do whatever he wants. He's been working his ass off for 4 years. But as a songwriter and a producer myself, admittedly at a much lower level than Brian, if you're formulating ideas for an album, you're not making an album, okay? If you're sitting down at a keyboard, once you've written a song, now you're making an album, okay? But until you get to that stage, if you're just sitting around thinking about it, a lot of us have sat around thinking about things that we never did. It's not making a record. And so I find this whole Brian spent 5 months thinking about the album. Yeah, he might have. You might have spent 5 months thinking about it, but we're in the 1960s timeline for a pop band. You can't spend 5 months thinking about an album. You kind of got to start working on the album, right? So when we get down to what was Brian doing at this time, yeah, he probably was thinking about what kind of album he wanted to do. He probably, at the very least, was thinking, well, I want to do more with these combinations of instruments. I want to do more with strings. There's evidence that when he finally did get to the studio, a lot of what he was doing was sort of test sessions to get his chops up for certain types of arranging, mainly arranging for orchestras and getting used to recording orchestras. Okay, that's all valid, but that, again, does not happen until, I think, October? Yes, mid-October. Brian's finally doing test sessions for his orchestral ideas. All right, so that's like 4.5 months after they do Summer Days, Summer Nights. And yeah, granted, they were recording the Party album in the middle of that, but the reason they were doing the Party album was Brian wasn't having anything ready for Christmas. Kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy to me, because if Brian sat down and did an album when he was doing Party, he'd have an album for Christmas. So I don't want to come down too hard on Brian, because remember in the Brian's Breakdown episode, I talked about the workload he was under, and the guy did deserve a rest. But on the other hand, he made an agreement with the band that you guys go on the road, I'm going to stay home and work on your stuff. And it doesn't look like he was doing a lot of working. He was doing a lot of thinking, but not a lot of working. What was Brian doing in the second half of 65? Well, like I said, he made Party, which was basically to buy him time to think of something to do. He did move at some point, and he talks in his biography about the sudden burst of creativity he had after he moved, which implies he didn't have much creativity going on before he moved. The one thing we know Brian was doing at the back end of 65, because his wife has talked about the problems it caused in their marriage, is he's doing a lot of drugs. And what kind of drugs? I'm not an expert on this. This is honestly something I've wanted to delve into too deeply, but we know that Brian did some acid, but probably not as much as people think he did. Definitely smoking a lot of pot, and at some point getting into amphetamines, and I'm wondering if the drug consumption and the types of drugs don't have something to do with the level of activity that he doesn't have in the back end of 65, and then the furious activity we're going to see Brian get into in the first half of 66, first quarter actually. So I've not seen anybody really talk about Brian's relative lack of creative work post Summer Days and Summer Nights, because I think everybody kind of wants to focus on what happened afterwards, which is this amazing album for Pet Sounds. But I just want to flag, it took him a long time to get rolling on this. And I have to wonder why. And it looks like he had a creative block, and also in a pattern we would see play out in his life, unfortunately, forever, is Brian will get into these situations where he's overcommitted to work, and he'll get exhausted, and he'll stop, and he'll plead for time out. And then when he gets time out, he starts to get unproductive and fall into bad habits. This looks like this might be the first time where this happens. It seems probable that, he's in LA, he's got free time, the band's off on the road, so they can't really chase him down. So he's like, yeah, I'm working on some new tunes, but doesn't look like he was working on that many new tunes. He punts to party really fast. He had time to get some stuff going, and he didn't. So how much he actually did have going before Pet Sounds really gets rolling, because there's a point where Pet Sounds really gets rolling, and we're going to get to that in a second. It seems like Brian was conceiving of an album that had something to do with regression to childhood. And this is a little disturbing, because in the Beach Boys today, lyrical bent, we see Brian grappling with adulthood and really trying to integrate himself as a fully formed adult. It's a really interesting album for that reason. And now we see Brian, concurrent with what seems to be increased drug use and withdrawal from the band, starting to think more in terms of cocooning himself and regressing. And that seems to be the concept of the record that he's formulating in the second half of 65. What we know is that he did one session for the song that would become Pet Sounds, which at that time was called Run James Run, but it wasn't even slated for the Beach Boys. Brian was doing it as a putative James Bond theme song. So he's not even making it for the band, and he does a couple of, as I said, test sessions to sort of get his arranging chops up. So he does a session for Stella by Starlight, How Deep is the Ocean, Three Blind Mice, which is basically, as I said, to get his orchestral chops up. He does Little Girl I Once Knew, as I said, and he does Trombone Dixie, which is a track that was on the bonus 1990 CD release of Pet Sounds. But again, Brian has said that was nothing. That was just something he pulled out of his briefcase. So Brian is still not really making new songs, right? The only thing he's doing is Little Girl I Once Knew, which comes out and doesn't do really well. And that's not until October. And the single comes out in November. And then Barbara Ann is released in its place and sort of rescues the Beach Boys' commercial fortunes, because Little Girl I Once Knew was kind of going down in flames relative to their prior work. As I said in the last episode, because of its adventurous two-bar pause that DJs mistook for dead air. So looking at the timeline and looking at what Brian actually accomplished, it doesn't look like Brian got a lot done post Summer Days and Summer Nights. He had all this time. He was supposedly working on the band's new music, but it seems like he's mostly thinking about it. Now, there is some evidence that Brian did have a few more tracks done, because Tony Asher, in various interviews for when he was brought on to the project, Tony Asher being the lyricist for Pet Sounds, and we're going to meet him in a minute, said that Brian did have some tracks already recorded. One of them was a song called In My Childhood, which was rewritten into You Still Believe in Me, and again followed this sort of childhood theme. Incidentally, I don't know at what point it was tracked. I think it was tracked in January. I'll check this. But the other instrumental on Pet Sounds, the Let's Go Away for a While, originally was going to be titled The Old Man and the Baby, which again feeds into this kind of odd return to childhood theme. So it seems like Brian had some vague concept of a return to childhood, and he'd done a couple of tracks. Asher implies there was more done than that. There were a couple other things that he had done. All I can say is I can't verify that. So Brian may have had a handful of tracks going into Pet Sounds. But the only things that we know that he had was the track for You Still Believe in Me, the track for Pet Sounds, and Sloop John B. And there may have been one or two other songs we don't know. But he didn't have much, right? So what finally shakes Brian up? Well, one thing seems to be his move to his new house, but the big thing is the release of the Beatles album Rubber Soul on December 3rd. Brian hears this recording and something sparks within him, because it's the first time that he has heard a full album that makes a complete statement. And this really excites him. Also sort of belies the idea that he had a concept of a concept album prior to this, because if he did, he wouldn't have been as fired by what the Beatles had accomplished. But be that as it may, particularly given that Brian was listening to the Capitol version of Rubber Soul, which was compiled in a way to give it a more cohesive folk rock sound that was more in tune, so Capitol thought, with the marketplace of the American market in 1965. But Brian hears this and goes, whoa, this is an album with no filler. It's all good stuff. This just sets him off. Brian, whatever motivation Brian had been lacking, whatever direction Brian had been looking for, Rubber Soul gives it to him. And Brian goes back to his wife, Marilyn, and says, I'm going to make the greatest rock and roll album ever made. And he sets out to do it. So Brian looks like he was fishing around for a while and maybe getting a little sidetracked. And then he hears Rubber Soul and he finds his groove. So then December, things start to really happen. First thing is, well, I don't want to say the first thing, but a significant thing is Brian finally gets around to finishing Sloop John B, brings the band in to do the spectacular vocal arrangement that they have, and also some guitar and some other things. And that's to prepare Sloop John B for a single release that will come after Barbara Ann, which is exactly what's going to happen. But more importantly, he calls in a new collaborator. And here we should acknowledge something that's been said for a long time, is that Brian seems to need a collaborator to do his best work. This isn't to take anything away from what Brian brings to the table, because it does seem in a lot of things that Brian did up to this point, it was 80% Brian. When people talk about Mike Love, the lead singer of the Beach Boys and sometime lyricist, when they sort of accuse Mike of overstating his contributions to the songs, this is sort of the basis of it, that Mike might be throwing in a line here, a line there, but Brian's doing most of it. But when Mike Love points out that his contributions were pretty key to making the songs commercial, he also has a point, because something you see with a lot of Brian's collaborators is it seems like they find the parts, the gaps in what Brian's doing, either the places where Brian hasn't completed his thoughts or where his thoughts are kind of wandering off into the ether, and they focus him up. And it may simply be that not just Brian maybe getting sidetracked by some bad habits, but that Brian didn't have the right collaborator to go wherever he wanted to go. Mike was on the road, and I think Brian had already decided at this point that Mike, for whatever his talents were, Brian wanted to go in a more artistic direction, and Mike wasn't going to help him get there. And neither were his prior collaborators, like Roger Christian, Gary Usher, any of these people. They were still firmly kind of in the surf and sand and cars realm. They weren't necessarily going to be the people that were going to achieve this vision for Brian. So Brian's best buddy at this time, a guy named Lawrence Schwartz, who's a very controversial figure in this story, because he is the person that introduced Brian to drugs, to LSD. He seems to have been Brian's sort of gateway to a new, hipper, more intellectual, and detractors would say more drug-cultured crowd of arty people in LA. So Lawrence Schwartz recommends a guy named Tony Asher, who was actually a jingle writer at a Los Angeles advertising agency. Now, Brian had already met Tony Asher at a session. I think Asher was cutting a jingle at the next studio over. They struck up a conversation, exchanged some ideas, made an impression on Brian. And then Lauren Schwartz comes to Brian and says, you ought to check this guy Asher out. He's really good with words. And so Brian brings Tony Asher in to rewrite the In My Childhood song, which turns into You Still Believe in Me. Asher does a good job. And then Brian decides, okay, this is the guy that can help me achieve this idea of this greatest rock and roll album of all time. So two things happen in December that are very, very key. Rubber Soul comes out, kicks Brian in the ass. And then Brian gets serious about finding a collaborator, and he finds Tony Asher. And even though Asher's never really written rock lyrics before, he turns out to be the right guy for the job. And so in January, let's switch over on the timeline here, Brian and Tony Asher get to work for reals, and they start churning out a bunch of new tunes. Now, the process for Brian and Tony's collaboration was somewhat organic and a fairly logical one. Tony would come over to Brian's house. They'd hang out kind of talking, getting to know each other. And you could see why this would be important to Brian, because all of his collaborators up until now were people that he'd built a friendship with before he actually started sitting down to work with them. And you see this, again, progress throughout Brian's life. You know, Brian needs to have a personal rapport. He's a very shy guy. He's an anxious guy. He needs to feel comfortable with the people he's working with. And so Brian and Tony would kind of get to know each other, talk about their common struggles as people in their early 20s and in grappling with romance and becoming adults and various schisms between men and women and how they relate to each other. And Brian would direct Tony into certain lyrical themes. And Tony has made it very clear that while Tony was the one that chose the words, Brian directed the subject matter. In a couple of cases, Tony wrote to pre-existing melodies, but more often it was a little more like Brian and Tony would talk about the lyrics, and Brian would play bits and pieces, and Tony would kind of go away and work up Brian's ideas into workable words. But Brian's focus on Pet Sounds, it's still a little bit about this lost childhood idea, but he's now forming it into a more adult and relatable idea. He's getting back to the transition to young adulthood, but instead of looking at it with the sort of, I'm struggling to make the adjustments that I need to be a better person and a fully functioning adult, which we saw the last time Brian expressed himself personally on the Beach Boys Today album. Now Brian is starting to talk about the hopes that one has of getting older, and contrasting that with a loss of innocence that comes when you start to process these realities in your career, in your romantic relationships, in your emotional state, and realize, quote Carl Wilson, everything isn't all Hollywood. I mean, there's a lot of things about becoming an adult that really suck. And so this loss of innocence theme is very key to Pet Sounds. And along with this, there is Brian's obsession with his wife's sister, Diane. Now, the sort of seamier side of the Beach Boys story is something that's been discussed a lot. I'm not going to delve that far into those things on this show. These are real people. You know, I know some of them. You know, I don't, and I also don't want to know. You know, I mean, there's people's personal lives are messy. You know, mine included. But there are some things we ought to talk about that are pertinent to the artistic and the music analysis part of what we do. And Brian's interest in his wife's sister is one of those things. And it's significant that even though Diane was older than Marilyn, Brian felt that she had a quality of innocence that I think encapsulated this thing that he was missing, that he felt sad about, that he expressed in songs like Caroline No, where he's talking directly about, depending on what version of the story you believe, someone that he had gone to high school with, or someone that Tony had gone to high school with, or his own wife. But this idea of a woman that had a kind of nice innocent quality about her, and that became more adult and thus less attractive or less kind or more threatening to Brian, or how, you're going to put your own prism on what that actually means, but the loss of innocence is a theme. And Brian's interest in his wife's sister, which sort of sprung from the fact that they were thrown together a lot more during this time because Diane was his contractor for the sessions. So they were spending a lot of time together. And spoiler alert, they did eventually get together on some level. Again, we're not going to get into that. I don't know how that all went down. Don't want to know. But I think the part of this that has to do with Brian's interest in Diane goes back to this loss of innocence idea, and Diane representing some ideal of innocence that Brian was thinking about at that time. And I want to say that there's a tragic element to the lyrical thrust of Pet Sounds, because as I said when we talked about the Beach Boys Today album, that's largely an album that is about Brian's desire and attempt to become a better person and a fully functioning adult. In Pet Sounds, we start to see that Brian is not going to make that transition, because a lot of these themes are sort of, when I sort of visualize this, it's almost like someone jumping for a rope and just missing grabbing it. And we see them sort of in the process of grabbing the rope and not grabbing it. That's sort of how I visualize the lyrics for this album, in the sense that Brian's, on side one, I think it's interesting. You've got songs that are about anticipation or the early stages of a romance. I mean, Pet Sounds has been accused of being a concept album. Lyrically, I don't think that's true. Brian has said it's really a production concept album, and I think that's accurate. But side one is all about sort of the early stages of romance and a certain wide-eyed sense of discovery about romance. There's self-discovery in all of the songs, or self-discovery or anticipation. And then you get Let's Go Away for a While, which is an instrumental, but it's titled like Let's Go on a Trip. And then we got Sloop John B, which has nothing to do with anything, but if you want to make it into a concept album, this young couple decides to take a vacation together. They go on a boat ride, and like many young couples on their first vacation together, discover they can't really get along that well in real life, which is, I don't really believe Brian planned this concept out, but actually, if you want to look at it that way, it makes perfect sense, because man, living in Bali, this has nothing to do with anything, but when I was living in Bali, and when I first went to Bali, I saw so many couples break up because it was their first big trip together to Bali. That's so romantic. And then they just, oh my God, but that's what happens on trips. So it's funny, Sloop John B seems to have nothing to do with anything. But we have Let's Go Away for a While, which is about going away for a while, I guess. It could be about anything, really. And then we've this worst trip we've ever been on. And then now when we get into side two, you got Here Today, or like things aren't good. And, it's just things aren't good all the way through side two. So there is, in terms of the sequencing, a flow from when I grow up, everything's going to be cool and I'm going to be with my girlfriend and everything's going to be awesome. And then side two is like, I don't like this so much. This isn't so great. So I don't think it was consciously intended, but I don't think the sequencing is a coincidence. I think Brian at least understood this was the flow of his composition and went with it. And certainly this is where Asher took Brian's train of thought. So, and this is one of the reasons I think this album resonates so much, not just with older people like me. I mean, I'm Gen X, so I wasn't around for the first release of Pet Sounds. So I have one relationship to it, but there's a whole cadre of younger Beach Boys fans for whom this album is totemic, including lots and lots and lots of indie musicians. I mean, this album is influential among younger people in a way it never was for my generation, for a lot of reasons that we're going to talk about. But I think the fact that it sums up so well the complexity of growing into adulthood, and especially as an introvert. And it is one of the very first rock albums that is from an introvert's perspective. Up until this point, rock and roll was all about swag. And now you have this album that is about somebody with some emotional issues and some attachment issues and probably a little bit on the spectrum. We don't know, but it seems likely. Working through some very complex human interactive issues. And as rock moved away from the cock swinging of the Led Zeppelin era and then into the sort of fun of the 80s into the post-grunge indie rock era, introspection as an artistic force becomes more prevalent, especially in the indie rock community. And you can see why Pet Sounds was such a touchstone for all these folks, because it spoke to these issues. And so when we look at the lyrics to Pet Sounds, that's what we've got. You know, this sense of the difficulty of transitioning to adulthood and into healthy relationships, and an understanding of your position in the social world, and maybe you're a little bit introverted, a little bit isolated, a little bit, I guess I wasn't made for these times, is one of the greatest, and as far as I know, one of the very first songs to talk about social alienation in the rock format. I mean, that song hits very, very hard for a lot of people, including me, because it just speaks to a certain very real phenomenon that wasn't part of the conversation up to that point. And like a lot of things Brian chose to write about, it's not something a lot of people are comfortable talking about. And Brian and Tony managed to put it in the terms of a pop song and make it work in early 1966. And that's an extraordinary achievement. And we shouldn't overlook, because we haven't even talked about the music yet, how much the lyrical themes, Brian's sort of quirky and a little out of the box and, you know, sometimes a little uncomfortable, the things he's thinking about. And Asher, as most of Brian's best collaborators did, were able to go, I get where you're going. I'm going to mold these ideas into something that's a little more where the normies are going to get it, and make it into great art. And that's what they did. So that's basically how the songwriting part of things went down. And Brian and Tony were doing some pretty focused work. Opinions differ as to how much focus was there, but fairly, you know, they got a lot done. And they got high quality work done. I mean, anytime you write a song like God Only Knows, or Wouldn't It Be Nice, you're doing a pretty good job, right? So this goes down at Brian's house in January and early February, and we're back on the timeline now. Brian starts tracking Pet Sounds for reals in the middle of January, and he starts with Let's Go Away for a While. So we talked about that earlier, so that's when he actually gets around to recording it. Then the track for Wouldn't It Be Nice on the 22nd. Then he's working some more, and You Still Believe in Me on the 24th, and the Caroline No on the 31st. And then you can see some pretty darn focused work. February, you got about half the month on sessions. In March, about half the month. April, they're working on this for 3 solid months. And this is something that also we need to flag. This is a lot longer than any Beach Boys album had taken prior to this. The Summer Days and Summer Nights had taken a while, but it was less focused work than this. Beach Boys Today, which is largely believed to be the Beach Boys' best pre-Pet Sounds album, that was about 2 weeks of focused effort and then a couple of scattered sessions before that. So now we're talking about 3 months. And a lot of that is Brian being extremely perfectionist about the vocals. We have a situation where the band at this time is on tour in Japan, and they're touring with Bruce Johnson. They have nothing to do with anything. They're just, Mike is hearing some of these tracks over the phone. Other than that, they don't have any sense of what's really going on. So when the band gets home from Japan, they start hearing this stuff for the first time. And there's a little bit of consternation at that point, and I'm going to talk about the band's reaction to this in more detail in a minute. But I want to focus for now on the timeline of getting the album done, and then we're going to talk about the various component aspects of that. But basically, Brian does the instrumental tracks. The band starts hearing them when they get back from the road. It looks like the first vocal session is around the middle of February. And Brian is a taskmaster. By all accounts, he's working the band much harder than he's previously worked them, looking for certain aspects of timbre and of performance and of pitch. And also, this is something that's not talked about a lot, but a lot of what caused the issues for the band not being able to complete the vocals quickly enough was rhythm. And this is something that's not talked about a lot, but this came up again, actually, when the Beach Boys did their disco remake of Here Comes the Night in 1978-79, a sort of notorious record of theirs. But it's a very impressive vocal performance, and one of the biggest issues they had was the tight syncopation that they had to execute to do a song in the disco idiom, which is all about time, right? So a lot of what Brian was looking for is that tight syncopation. And this is tricky, and I've run into this as a producer working with horn guys. In fact, I've worked with some pretty, top of the line horn guys. And even with them, sometimes I had to kind of discipline them a little bit about, you need to be right on that thing. Because for horns to sound tight, especially if you're playing funk or soul, they can't be sloppy. They got to be right on the one, right? So this can also be true of vocals because you're thinking about your pitch, you're thinking about your blend, you're thinking about your tone. You may not be thinking about your rhythm, and the rhythm moving tightly, as it had to do in a song like "Wouldn't It Be Nice," where you've got the midsection, which is maybe if we think and wish and hope it might come true. The ooh, where everything's going on the end. The vocals got to be right on it. So there was trying to get all these elements together to the degree that Brian wanted them was tough for the band. And so they were having to work a lot harder than they were used to working, on top of the music being quite complex and also lyrically maybe what they weren't used to. This goes on for, like I said, about 3 months. Now, during this time, Brian does start to track Good Vibrations, and for a short period, this is slated to be a part of Pet Sounds. And the band really, really wants it to be on Pet Sounds, but Brian is like, and we're not doing it. And it gets knocked off the album in late February or early March, because Brian decides it needs more work. Brian finally finishes the album in early April, and then he changes his mind and he goes back and does some more work. In at least one of these mixdown sessions, Brian surprisingly did the mix very, very quickly, according to everybody that was observing the session. Now, I don't actually know if this was the final mix of things or if this was one of the earlier mixes, but we do know that there are some significant technical flaws on Pet Sounds. There's a couple edits that are audible, and there's famously in Here Today in the instrumental breakdown, you can hear Bruce Johnston talking between vocal takes, and Brian also, and they just left that track up for whatever reason, and that does. The argument's been made by people like David Leaf that it's not sloppy recording, it's part of the music. Yeah, retrospectively, it's part of the music, but I think it's probably sloppy recording. So there is a little evidence that Brian, even though he had an intense amount of focus on this record and did an impressive amount of work and kind of reined it in, at the end he may have dropped the ball ever so slightly, just in impatience to get it done. And again, this seems to be kind of a thing with Brian sometimes, and again, why it seems like he does seem to need collaborators from time to time. And we'll see this with what comes after, is having a lot of ideas, getting really caught up with them, and the more elaborate Brian's ideas get, and by now they're getting really elaborate, the longer it takes and the more it's going to tax Brian's attention span, which is now being eroded to some extent by drugs and mental illness. So I don't want to make too big a deal out of Bruce Johnston talking on a track, because obviously Pet Sounds is one of the greatest albums of all time, and we've all gotten used to hearing Bruce talking about cameras in the background or whatever the minor technical flaws of the album are. I mean, it's still a great record. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying it's interesting that that's a pretty basic flaw to leave in a final mix. Even for 66, when you had all these technical limitations, all you got to do is wipe that part of the track or mute it or whatever. They had the technology to do that at the time. They didn't do it. So it does indicate a little bit of sloppiness or rushed behavior on Brian's part at the end. Although at that point also he was under significant pressure from Capitol to get the damn thing done. And you can see why. I'm going to defend Capitol for what's going to be the last time on this show. They have shelled out $70,000 in 1966 dollars. That's something like 600 grand, 700 grand now. Enormous amount of money for the time. Probably the most expensive album ever made at that point. And they, thank God they came up with the Party album, because that moved a lot of units for Capitol, and it didn't require much sweat from Brian, because they would have been real upset if they didn't have anything since Summer Days and Summer Nights, because it's been nearly a year since their last proper studio album. Summer Days, Summer Nights came out, I think, in July of 65. Early July, if I'm remembering correctly from a few minutes ago. And now we're into mid-May. That's 10 and a half months since their last proper recording, which is sort of masked by the fact that Beach Boys Party came out and a single or two in the interim that kept their profile high. But in terms of a full album, it's taken a long time. And so Capitol had a right to, dude, you're spending a lot of money. Where's our record? Come on, give it up. And the crazy part of it is there's some indication that after all that time and money, Capitol wanted to scrap the record. But it must be said, for all that effort and all that time and all that money, Brian achieved his goal. He made one of the greatest rock and roll albums ever made, and by some estimations, he did make the greatest album ever made. So now we're going to get into what made it special, how the band reacted to it, how the record label reacted to it, and how the world reacted to it.